Yeah, everybody, back with a little more content from the content minds here on YouTube. As somebody who has watched China for many years and has a PhD in China studies, I always find it really interesting when China in an international context makes its way into U.S. News narratives, U.S. Media discourse in particular. When you talk about the China-U.S. relationship and how it makes it into the news in this country. And that's been happening, obviously, with the Blinken trip to Beijing, and also some of Biden's recent comments about Xi Jinping being a dictator. Uh, Obviously, China's made it back in the news in a big way, and you have a lot of people who think they're qualified to talk about the China-U.S. relationship, saying things like, this is the lowest ebb in the relationship since normalization under Nixon, right? And these are sort of the memes that started to get trotted out on Twitter and CNN and elsewhere. And I just wanted to come out and say, obviously, that's ridiculous. There have been many times where the China-U.S. relationship has been worse. And I think what's concerning about thinking about this as the lowest point in U.S.-China relations is that's what the Chinese policy preference is right now, right? That's what they're saying about it. So that very much might represent their perspective on the dyad, right, on the bilateral relationship. But that doesn't mean that the entire relationship is the worst it's ever been. I mean, you can think about, very clearly, 1989 and Tiananmen Square comes to mind as quite definitively the lowest point in the relationship. I think from a bilateral perspective, but also certainly from a U.S. and a Western alliance perspective, even a decade before that. Obviously, in 1979, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which requires the U.S. to arm Taiwan, to sell arms to Taiwan. That's always been nebulous, but that's another indication of this has not always been the smoothest road. In the mid 1990s, 1995, 1996, Taiwan elected its first president in a transition from sort of a more autocratic regime to a more open and democratic regime. And during that time, not only did China suspend high-level talks when a president of Taiwan visited the United States, during that election cycle, China, the People's Republic of China, fired missiles at or near Taiwan to discourage voter turnout, to discourage the idea of an election occurring there. Obviously, those missiles didn't hit Taiwan itself, but they basically sort of feigned a military attack with missiles to keep people from voting. In 1999, there was a NATO bombing of a Chinese embassy in the Balkans. That was a really big deal that people often forget about, but was a huge deal on the Chinese side of the relationship. For obvious reasons. And then, you have basically the entire Trump administration, right? Pence saying competition over cooperation, Trump noting that China's a currency manipulator, the Uyghur Human Rights Act and the subsequent sanctions of individuals under that, everything related to the Hong Kong security law and the international outcry about that, and the beatings of protesters and the arrest of people of people who sell books. That was obviously a huge deal. And then, one of the planks of Trump's foreign policy, right, putting hundreds of billions of dollars of sanctions onto Chinese goods, right. These were all things that really damaged the bilateral relationship. And to say that where we're at right now, which is essentially. Biden taking a more proactive stance on deterrence, taking a more proactive stance on basing, taking a very proactive stance on a very firm stance on China not supplying Russia with weapons for the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration has been quite tough, and while that I'm sure has degraded the relationship on the Chinese side of this, that's one side of the relationship. Right, and they don't get to decide that it's at the lowest point unilaterally, right? And indeed, if you were arguing that this lapse in communication and diplomatic channels is indicative of the lowest state of U.S.-China relations in some time, Anthony Blinken just fixed that, right? That just ended. So that doesn't really hold water either. And I think this is just important. It's important to remind ourselves that because of the consolidation and the control, the relative consolidation control over the news and social media system within the People's Republic of China, we need to continue to stay cautious and steel ourselves and be aware that if you see people or you hear people communicating information that closely aligns with the information that's coming out of the Chinese Communist Party, it very likely is because that's what they have been instructed to do from the Chinese Communist Party, right? We have to constantly remind ourselves that while the United States or any of these other sort of pluralistic, open, democratic societies that interact with China aren't perfect societies. I'm not saying that. The United States has decades and decades of work to do to become a better place for everybody. But you do have, politically speaking, you have the impact of two tectonic plates, right? These are two different systems colliding and rubbing up against one another, and one is pluralistic and open and has a strong civil society, and one does not. So if the Biden administration comes out and says that they have some preference or some idea about China, there could be people in the news and so obviously in nonprofits, within the federal government itself, a whole host of people can come out and dispute that narrative, right? And refute it and try to assert their own preference. That is not the case in China, right? So if you find that there's one sort of message that keeps showing up from the Chinese side, that's what's happening, right? That is the message of the Chinese Communist Party, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to it. We should listen to it. We should digest it. We need to understand their perspective in the dyad, because we want peace. We want a collaborative relationship, if at all possible. But it's important to remember that message will be more consolidated, and it will be more tightly constrained to the policy preferences of the Chinese Communist Party and its elite leadership. So that's really what I wanted to say, was that, again, I just don't think that where we're at right now qualifies as the lowest point in this relationship, and I think that's really something that's being pushed by one side of the U.S.-China dyad or bilateral relationship for obvious reasons, right? It helps the Chinese side in terms of negotiating to make that appear to be the case. So as always, really appreciate you watching and really psyched to read your comments as always. Thanks again.